The Central Club.
What's going on, people? Welcome to the Central Club. This episode is brought to you by Reinspire Printing and Boss Security. If you haven't already, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the club, and hit the bell button to be notified of future content. We have another, I would say, religious guest on our show today. Someone totally different to our last one. We did have quite a bit of controversy and backlash on the last one, but I will say that this one is probably on the other side of the spectrum, and this one is very special today, very well known. And if you're a Welshman, you should be proud of this man, because this man has broken down a lot of barriers and stood up to a lot of things in life. He's an Anglican bishop, a theologian. Would you say a theologian? I think that's
theologian.
Theologian. He's a poet, and he was the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you, Mr. Dr. Rowan Williams.
Hello there.
Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
How are you?
Pretty good, thanks. Yes. Looking forward to another busy week at the moment.
Yes. What, you're always busy, Rowan.
Well, it's something I did in my previous life, probably. But yes, you mentioned the Welsh thing, and I'm part now of the Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales. We've got some work planned for this week. We're going to meet the Welsh Affairs Committee in Parliament later this week. So that's something to think about.
Yeah, fantastic. It's like you never stop.
Well, I still have this fantasy that one of these days people will stop writing letters and I can just stay in bed a bit later.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no retiring for you anytime soon.
Not a lot.
Is there? Well, thank you for coming. For people who don't know, this has all come about through, well, I'd like to say, first of all, thank you to my boss, Martin Blakeborough, because if it wasn't for him, I would never have met you. So you've done a talk in St. John's Church in the centre of Cardiff. I know Vicar Sarah, who has an open space for myself there. We actually run a drug service drop in there. Wonderful church, wonderful people. And I got to hear you do a public talk in the church with a bit of Q&A, and I was fascinated by it all, really. I knew of you, didn't really look into you too much, maybe because I was a bit busy in my past life as well. But I had to ask you if you'd be up for this, and I was really grateful that you said yes.
Oh, well, thanks for asking.
Yes, of course. I think someone with the experience and the knowledge and the voice you have is such a wonderful voice. I'm so glad you're blessing us here. But this is a massive pleasure. So thank you.
Thank you.
I did see on TV last week. I seen you on TV with Nick Cave at the King's Coronation.
Yes, it's a slightly unusual mix, isn't it?
It is. It's like one of those photos, when they say like name the band, and there's like two random people you would see together, but it's not random because you've built quite a relationship with Nick Cave, haven't you?
That's right. His publishers sent me his book, Faith, Hope and Carnage, just before Christmas last year, and wanted to know what I thought about it. And I read it, and I thought this is really one of the most extraordinary books I've read this year, or for many years. A real sort of testimony of his own struggles, his own sufferings, his own wrestling with faith, with God, with life and death, his own bereavement, the tragedies in his life. And I thought this is just such a one-off book. And I wrote back to the publisher saying all that, and they obviously forwarded it to Nick. And the next thing I knew, we were booked together to do a conversation for the Sunday Times about the book and about his life and so on. We got on very, very well. And yes, a few days before the coronation, I had this email from him saying, I'm going to be there, let's say hello. So we did. And the thing I'll remember is I was talking in the queue to, I think it was a mayor from somewhere in the east of England. And somebody tapped me on the shoulder. I turned around. It was Nick. So we had a hug and we had a quick word. I went back to the mayor from Peterborough. And he said, that I was not expecting. So slightly magical moment. But he's such an extraordinary human being, Nick. The creativity, the energy, the courage coming through all that he's come through, the sort of dramatic and disturbed personal life, the tragedies he's lived through, and all the way through this creative, poetic voice coming through in the music. Yeah. Quite a man.
Yeah, he is. He is certainly a talented artist, I would say. Wonderful writer.
Wonderful writer. Wonderful writer. And the thing that strikes me, speaking as a person of faith, is that if anybody says people turn to faith as a soft option to give you nice, easy answers and a comfortable life, I can now say, well, Nick Cave,
Yeah.
it's not like that.
No. And, I think, understanding the work he has done and probably taking that in.
Yeah.
Did you kind of respect him more for that, being a poet yourself?
Very much so. I really sense the authentic poet's voice in what he writes. This isn't just, I don't know, paint by numbers songwriting. This is real poetry.
Yeah.
It's tough. It's unexpected. It's funny. It's difficult. It's wonderful. Everything poetry ought to be.
Is this something that you listened to before you even met him? Like, was you a Nick Cave fan, or was this something that you took on?
I hadn't listened to a lot, but my son kept me informed about this. He's my main source of information about contemporary culture, and he is now sort of speechless with jealousy that I've managed to meet Nick.
Yeah, I bet he is. And how was the King's Coronation? What was it like being there?
Well, difficult to get it into a few words, really. Just looking around and seeing so many bits of our culture, bits of our national map represented. And that was one of the things that struck me. There were a lot of people there representing voluntary organizations, people representing not just the great and the good, but the grassroots people. I think they'd invited about 200 people from voluntary groups around the country to represent that. And I met some of them in the queue beforehand. And so that gave a slightly different slant. It wasn't just the ambassadors and the generals.
Yes.
So that was one thing. Second thing, I think, was the amazing music before, during, and after the service. It was, quite apart from everything else, it was quite a concert.
Yeah, I've seen Bryn Terfel was there representing.
Bryn Terfel was there, yes. And a lot of people who didn't know Welsh found that really moving. And I love his voice at the best of times, but that particular setting, Lord have mercy in Welsh, Arglwydd Trigarha, that done as he did it with the choir was a wonderful beginning to the service. So yes, it was memorable. It was memorable. If I'm honest, I think we could probably have done with a little bit less of the what I think of as the rather folkloric things like the spurs and the swords and and so forth. But
yeah, that's interesting.
I mean, basically, this is a service where the king says, what I'm here to do is service, and he's there to take Holy Communion. That's the bottom line. And over the centuries, all these other things with
being added in.
Yeah. So I think I might have wanted to trim back a bit, but I guess he's serious about tradition. He probably wanted some of that.
Yeah. So for people who don't know, I'm sure people do know who are crazy fans of the Royals, but you actually married. You didn't actually marry. You was the one who held the marriage for the royal wedding of William and Kate. So would it have been the same thing with that? If you were still Archbishop at the time, would you have been the one doing the coronation?
I would, yes.
And you would have stripped back on a lot of those things, you think?
I might have put that into the mix a bit, yes.
Yes.
But it's difficult always to get the balance between continuity and the contemporary, and there's no formula for it. And
just quickly on the royals as well, the royal wedding that you took of, what was that like?
Oh, I enjoyed that. I enjoyed getting to meet them. Very, very charming couple. And it's always good to be part of a really positive and uncomplicated celebration. It felt a bit like that. They were clearly very devoted to each other, clearly sensible people who thought about not only the public but the private role, because being a married couple in public is not a joke. It's not easy, as many of the other royals will illustrate.
Found out. Yeah.
And they thought about it, and yes, it just felt positive, felt joyful. And I remember, I don't think this is a state secret, but I do remember the princess, as she now is, saying she was a bit nervous about 5 billion people watching. I remember saying, well, I can promise once you're up there, You'll think about the people around you. You won't be thinking about who's watching in Hong Kong. You really won't.
Some comforting words there.
Well, you need to know that, I think, because it can be paralyzing living under the spotlight all the time.
No, I can only imagine, you know, I get worried putting out an episode every Sunday. Quickly as well, did you have any relationship, or did you get to meet Her Majesty, the Queen Elizabeth?
We met fairly regularly. Yes, we'd have a one-to-one once a year. We'd meet on other occasions, occasionally at a meal or something. Remarkable woman. More of a sense of humour than a lot of people realised. She could be very deflating. She'd puncture you if you were pompous. She'd challenge you sometimes. Always supportive. Always sensible. I had huge admiration for her. But I think also by the end I just got very fond of her, really. I guess, like a lot of people of my age, she was my parents' sort of age. And a little bit of that gets transferred, doesn't it?
Naturally.
Public figures like that.
Yeah, definitely.
I remember writing something, actually, when she died, for one of the journals, saying that for me, I could identify the way in which the British public had thought about her over the years with the way we think about our parents generally. You know, first, when we're very young, our parents are the most glamorous thing possible. And you think of the young Queen Elizabeth in the 1950s. And then when we're teenagers, oh, they're so boring, they don't understand anything. And there's a bit of that in the 60s and 70s. And then gradually, as they get older and you get older, you think, you know, actually they know a thing or two.
Yes.
Maybe it's not the end of the world if I listen to them now and then.
Yes, you're right.
And then we really miss them.
Exactly. Well, let's talk about maybe a bit of background with your parents and yourself. Because I was very shocked when I found out you was from Swansea.
Well, strictly speaking, Ystrad in the Swansea Valley.
The Swansea Valley, yes.
So, yes, that's still very important to me. Swansea's what I think of as home. And my mother's family had been in Ystrad for, I think about 150 years. And before that, they'd been farmers in Carmarthenshire. That's one side of the family. The other side came from Pembrokeshire. My father's family, Swansea Valley and Dowlais for a bit in the mines. So
okay.
The two bits of Welsh life, really. The farming
the mining and the farming. And was there a religious background with your parents?
Not very committed. I mean, they went to chapel when I was young, and then later on to church. But they weren't, they weren't hyperactive in that world. I think they were a bit surprised when that was the way I went.
Yeah. And you had so many inspirations in your life growing up. I've come to know.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I was really lucky at school, and I think in the local church too. I've often said that for a lot of people in their teenage years, religion, the church, whatever, sort of fades away because you feel it's too small. It can't cope with how complicated real life is. And I had the opposite experience. I had a priest locally who just kept the horizons open all the time. That was such a blessing. And the same in school.
Yes. And did you always know that you was going to, as much as you love Swansea, did you always know that you would get out and travel and be the person you are?
I don't think I'd ever really expected to be quite what I turned out to be in the end. I wanted to get away from Swansea to study. Going to Cambridge felt like a great opportunity, and
yes.
Loved that. And well, things happened, don't they? Doors open, opportunities present. You get sort of shunted into things, and next thing I was teaching theology and not immediately looking to go back. And then, rather surprisingly, had the call to go back as bishop in Newport, Bishop of Monmouth, and actually felt that's wonderful. I can take stuff back now. I can go back home with some of what I've picked up. Yeah.
And you spent quite some time as a Bishop of Monmouth. I think what especially the viewers would kind of be interested in is, how does someone become a Bishop of Wales and then all of a sudden begin for the shout of being the Archbishop of Canterbury?
Well, yes. The Church in Wales and the Church of England do work a bit differently. They're independent bodies since 1920, when a great deal of funding was taken away from the Church in Wales and handed over to the local authorities. And that sort of thing. So the Church in Wales has done its own business, run its own affairs since then. And that's also meant that in Wales, being a bishop means you get elected by a group coming from the area you're going to be bishop of. So there's an electoral college, which has 6 people from each of the dioceses, the bishoprics in Wales, plus an extra 6 from the vacant diocese, and you've got to get a 2/3 majority in that group to be elected. So that's how it happens. In England, it's a bit different because it's still the case that legally, formally, the appointment comes from the crown, from the monarch. So again, there's a little group that takes statements, interviews, does a bit of background research, and then settles on a name which they give to the Prime Minister, who gives to the King or Queen, and they sort of sign off on it. So technically, in England, it's a state appointment. In practice, it's not so very different.
Okay. And I didn't realise this as well, but you was the first Archbishop from Wales to go to Canterbury.
That's right.
And there was there a bit of like controversy behind that? Is there, like, how did you manage to do that, from break away from this tradition?
I wish I knew. It was a surprise. I'm not just being coy. It was a surprise. I hadn't been expecting that. And I think it was a bit hard on bishops in England to have somebody coming in from outside too. And certainly when I started as Archbishop, I felt a bit at a disadvantage. I hadn't been part of the system in England. I didn't quite know how things worked.
Yes.
So steep learning curve, let's say, at that point.
Was you always a poet then as well, Rowan?
Well, I guess back to my teens, yes. Like lots of people, I wrote plenty of bad poems when I was at school. You know how you do. Teenagers getting their getting their feelings out there.
100%.
And then I guess in my 20s, middle 20s, when I was first teaching, just something stirring again. And I thought, I've got to work harder at this. So it's not just a matter of pouring out your feelings on paper. You've got to think, you've got to organise your words, you've got to listen harder and be a bit clearer about what you want to say.
Yes.
And I think it's that period from sort of 25, 26 onwards that I really started writing a bit more seriously. But I didn't publish anything until I was over 40.
I think some people could really look at you and say, wow, he's like he's another Dylan Thomas, old Rowan coming from Swansea.
Well, there's the problem, I think, in Swansea. You've got Dylan Thomas kind of breathing beer fumes over your shoulder all the time. He's the great local name. So when you're a teenager, you think, next Dylan Thomas. And you write imitation Dylan Thomas poetry.
Inspiration.
So you've got to find your own voice.
That's your own voice, your own style. Yeah. And it's fascinating because I think in this day and age, we have a lot of people who, are in music, whether that's, songwriting in a band, but you do also have a lot of people who do like this rap culture, this type of stuff. And I think if they were brought up in your era, they would just be poets. Or maybe if you was brought up in ours, who knows that you'd be writing music?
I guess that's right. And I think the mistake we make sometimes is trying to get some kind of hierarchy about this, saying, well, this is a better way of being an artist than another.
I agree.
There was a big controversy in one of the poetry magazines about 3 or 4 years ago about performance poets and rap artists and so forth. Are they real poets? And quite a savage controversy, because somebody wrote a very critical article in this magazine saying performance poets, people like Kay Tempest, they really don't count because it's just stuff pouring out. And then people pushing back and saying, now hang on, this is what it is. It's not a bad version of other sorts of poetry.
Yeah.
It's a good version of what it is.
Of what it is, yeah.
And trying to keep that in all sorts of areas, I find myself coming back to this. There are different ways of being excellent. There are different ways of being excellent, not just the one.
I like that. I think what I want to get out of this interview is, Rowan, is kind of something probably everyone's trying to grasp, really, and that is where we're going in life, the times we're in. Maybe every kind of generation or century says this, but I do feel like we are living in a fascinating time. And there is a lot of conversation of like religion and the human rights and stuff kind of overlapping. There was something you said, which I've quoted here, and I didn't know if this was a part of what you were saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I just kind of wanted to know what you meant by this. But you said orthodoxy is seen as a tool rather than an end to itself. It is not something that stands still. Thus, old styles come under increasing strain, and new speech needs to be generated. Are you talking about the language within orthodoxy, or are you talking about the practice?
Bit of both, I think. It's really back to what we were saying about the coronation, the balance between continuity and innovation, the balance between having your roots solidly somewhere and being flexible, being responsive to what's really out there. And I think that applies in all sorts of areas of our life. I think what I meant with that phrase was orthodoxy, certainly in, let's say, in Christian doctrine, matters, but it matters not because I've got to get the words right or I've got to get the ideas right, but because here are some words and ideas which have actually enriched and enlarged people's lives in certain ways. That's what makes it worthwhile. It's a tool to grow. If it stops being that, in a way, it's no longer orthodoxy. It's just become a kind of ideology.
Yes. No, I understand that.
And there's a poem that I translated from Welsh not so long ago by Euros Bowen, who was a very celebrated, rather complicated Welsh poet in the last century. And the last line of it is something like, we have to have something that prevents the word of truth becoming just an ideology about Christ.
I understand that. And it's very hard to kind of make that mistake.
Sure. But no, I think you're right. I think we are living in a very strange period where we're really at sea over all kinds of things because we don't quite know what a good human life looks like. What do we want to help other people find their way into as a good human life? What are we educating people in? What do we aspire to be and want to be as human beings? And occasionally I've said that the problem of a very secular, post-religious environment isn't so much that people stop believing in God as they also stop believing in humanity in some ways. And pushing that, getting back to keep those together. Yeah. That's why I'm interested in the crossover between religion and human rights, really.
Yeah. I think talking about the podcast we done a couple of weeks back with a certain Calvin Robinson was, I think what he was saying was how we've moved with times and how we have stepped away from Christianity is kind of the reason we've had that decline in the way we live our lives and how chaotic we are. And would you agree with that?
Up to a point, I think, because I think secularism, such a post-religious environment, it's not just about losing our religious sense. It is often about losing some aspects of our imaginative lives, our artistic lives, thinning out or narrowing down what we believe about human beings. And I think the loss of religious faith is an important part of that. It's not as if we had, 90% of the population going to church and subscribing precisely to what some Christians would like them to sign up to. It's not as if our social problems would be solved overnight.
Yeah.
But I think it's extremely important for Christians to be there in the public discussion, saying from time to time, look, hang on a minute, what about? Asking awkward questions, saying, isn't that begging the question here? Isn't that narrowing it down a bit? And I find this particularly when we're thinking about education, because lots of controversy about educational methods these days. And I do think we've got to a point where it sounds as if a lot of the time all we're really interested in education is getting people through the hoops, getting them to jump through the free order.
Yeah.
And tick box mentalities. And I feel something really a bit boring and a bit reductive about that. And I wish educational institutions had a bit more courage and freedom to stand back and say, well, we've got to give people some time and space to grow, to take risks, to think difficult thoughts, not to be jumped on straight away, and to approach the subjects they're studying with a sense not just what do I need to squeeze out of this to get through exams, but what do I need to hear and absorb from this that makes me a bit more human?
Yeah.
I don't know how we do it, but I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah. I think there's just so much pressure on people in this, you know, with labeling and these type of things that people are quite worried to be that, you know.
I think so. Yes, a lot of people in education get very nervous about this because if you step out of line or you don't produce the goods, and then the institution comes down on you.
Yeah.
My daughter's a primary school teacher, so I get reports from the front line about this from time to time.
Yeah, my mother is as well, actually.
Oh,
yeah, funny.
It's a great job.
Yeah, she loves her job. Some of the stories she comes back and tells, and she comes and asks me if I can help her with this type of music, dance. They're trying to teach the kids and stuff, but at the same time as you get the great stuff, you also get the bad stuff.
You get the bad stuff,
back as well. Like, and it's yeah. So if you had, I've said this question to someone before, but if you had the jurisdiction and the reins to kind of implement the educational system, what would be like some of the mandatory things you would teach?
I think I might start by reducing the number of tests that children do up to the age of 14.
Okay.
There are other ways of checking whether you're doing a good job than simply putting people through a sausage machine. And I think that's what we've got at the moment. So I'd start there. I'm very impressed by what I see sometimes in, say, Montessori schools and these slightly off-the-wall, more experimental schools.
Yeah.
I think of not only of Montessori, but the Steiner schools and schools like that, where there's a great emphasis on shaping character, not just knowledge, where children are expected to spend quite a bit of time in constructive play rather than just being drilled, where there's an emphasis, again from early on getting children used to looking at the natural world. I'd want to have a bit more of that, because we're in a civilization where our relationship with the natural world is all over the place. Either we ignore it or we exploit it. And one thing I've loved looking at in some of these more experimental schools is the way in which children are encouraged really to look at what's around them. And you can do this in the mainstream system too. I remember one of my favourite schools in the world. It's a primary school in Beswick in Manchester. When I was Archbishop, the kids there used to write to me regularly.
Oh, nice.
So once a month I'd have a letter from the school, and I visited whenever I could, and they used to come to London for an outing for a day and have a picnic at Lambeth Palace once a year. But last time I visited there, they were sorting out a sort of community garden, a kitchen garden, growing vegetables and that sort of thing. So the kids were really literally getting their hands dirty.
So they're getting their hands dirty. They're learning how to grow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what it has been, say the last 2 decades maybe, is that it's the naughty kids who have to go to these other type of schools to do these kind of active things. But I think it's really important for everyone to go through that and find who you are as a person.
Find who you are, yes. That's what education really ought to set you free for. Yes. And if you feel that the opposite is happening, something is askew in the system. I also think about the huge revolution that children go through moving from primary to secondary education. It's as if when kids are 11, we build a sort of iron curtain and say to them, in effect, okay, a lot of it's been fun up to now. This is where the fun stops.
I agree.
And you're in a big jungle of other children you don't know and who can be pretty threatening. You've got to get through test after test after test after test, and maybe in 6-7 years' time you'll be adjudged good enough to go on and be tested again at university, and maybe after that, just maybe after that, you might get a job in which you will be scrutinised within an inch of your life for the rest of your life until you retire and drop dead. Now, is that the story we want to be telling?
No, it's not. It's not,
is it? And if you ask most people in the system about that, that's what they'll tend to say. That doesn't sound like it. That doesn't sound right.
Just want to jump in quickly, guys, and let you know that us here at the Central Club podcast, we work really, really hard to give you this content. You know, people think setting up a podcast is just as simple as pressing play on a camera, but it's like a full-time job. And, you know, when I first started this podcast, I promised myself that I wouldn't cut corners. That's all I've ever done in my life is cheat and, you know, get a head start on things. But I always knew that I wanted to start from the ground up with this. And I've made sure that everything is to a high standard. But with that comes a lot of time and a lot of money. And all I ask for you is take out less than 1 second in your life to please press subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. What do you know about Wales' #1 rated security provider, Boss Security? Boss Security Limited are a professional security service provider based in South Wales but servicing clients on a national scale. With over 10 years of experience in the security industry, they are true experts in all aspects of security. From CCTV monitoring, manned guards, mobile patrols and alarm response, they provide the most advanced technology on the market, along with an expert team of staff delivering complete security solution to their clients throughout the UK. Just quickly, with the human rights and religion kind of pathway, can you give me any other typical collisions we might see in the near future, or we are seeing, what kind of problems we're seeing with the two crossing over?
Well, of course, we see it quite a bit, don't we, in the whole area of gender politics and that sort of thing. And I think there's a lot of confusion here. On the one side, people look at religious bodies and they tend to assume they've all got rather repressive attitudes about sexuality. And so the right to freedom of religion is a bit controversial because we don't want people with bigoted and repressive attitudes all over the place. On the other hand, people in religious communities of various sorts will look at the world around and say, well, going to hell in a handcart as far as all that's concerned. So we reserve the right to protest and object to that. Both those attitudes seem to be very misplaced. I think it's perfectly possible to say society guards the freedom of every person to make choices, including bad choices, to the extent that they don't wreck other people's lives. And that freedom to make choices you may not yourself approve of, that's a matter of civic liberty and human dignity. And look at Uganda and their legislation against gay people. It seems to me that that is a really oppressive and anti-human, and I would say anti-religious approach, as if you can compel people to avoid certain kinds of behavior. So I had this controversy when I was Archbishop, of course, about the position of gay people in the church. And the line I always took was, just park your attitudes about the ethics of same-sex behavior for a moment and ask about the civil rights and freedoms of individuals. Do you actually want to put people in prison for disagreeing with you?
Yeah.
And trying to get Anglican leaders across the world, including some of the very conservative ones in Africa, to say, okay, we don't like this, but we will accept the legal and political human rights perspective. Hard work. Yeah. We got somewhere with it, but not very far. And within the church, all the churches, it's a very divisive issue, to say the least, at the moment.
Even fractured within. So are you talking that this is very fractured within just areas and communities as well?
It is, yes. And
sad.
I can't remember who said this, but I think there's some truth in it. Sometimes the church is a place where a lot of the anxieties that are washing around in society get expressed a bit more sharply sometimes.
Yeah.
As if we may think we've solved a problem. We may think we've got over a hill with attitudes to women or to gay people or whatever. But actually, a lot of people are still wriggling in their seats. Yeah. And a lot of those seats are going to be pew-shaped. So
yes.
Not entirely surprising if the church takes a while to catch up. And one principle I've frequently appealed to is, you want change, fine. But if you make change too quickly, you make it less likely to stick or to, really to command people's loyalty. if you take time making a decision, the time you need, maybe that decision will be deeper rooted and a bit more long lasting. But it's frustrating because people are very impatient. Sometimes they're right to be, and we need, I think, people who are very impatient to push it on, and people who say, yeah, hang on, let's make sure we're taking the time it needs.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense. Another conversation I would like to talk about, which again, Calvin was very strong against, was the faith of Islam.
Ah, right.
I know you've been quite a strong supporter and collaborator with clerics or people of faith and stuff. There was something that you said though that I found really interesting, and I would like to just kind of get your take on it. And it was saying that partial adoption of Sharia law is unavoidable and should not be resisted.
Yeah. Now that was one of the things which I think made me briefly the most unpopular person in Britain. I did say to my successor when he became Archbishop, there's going to be one moment when it all falls in on you.
Well, I think I agree with that in a sense, because correct me if I'm wrong, but are you trying to say there that people who actually practice that religion, who are very in the know of it, can do it? Or
well, let me tell you what I meant by that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out.
Yeah. What I meant by that intervention all those years ago.
Yeah, all those years ago, sorry.
Well, 2008, I think, wasn't it? First of all, communities with very strong shared convictions, like Islamic communities in the UK, I think have a reasonable right to do their own business and sort out some of their issues within their own terms, so long as those terms don't infringe on the general liberty people enjoy as citizens of this country. So it's a balance. You think of some traditional, not necessarily law-based attitudes in Islam to women. You don't want to go along with any kind of practice that reduces or demeans the status of women. You may think there are aspects of Muslim law and custom which could helpfully be delegated to the community itself.
Yes.
Or laws of inheritance, or the management of property, charity, that sort of thing. All those. Now, when I said that some legal recognition of Sharia law seemed to me an arguable idea, it was partly because I think it's in principle quite a good idea for the law of the land to say in certain contexts, okay, you sort that out. It's not our pay grade. You sort that. Also because there are quite a lot of independent, freelance Muslim courts around whose judgments can be a bit eyebrow-raising. Isn't it better to have a system whereby the Muslim courts are kind of integrated into the system? There's an agreed form of recognizing that some Muslim courts might work better in some contexts, but would still be accountable to the British legal system overall. There are some areas in the law of the church, some areas in the laws of Orthodox Judaism, which already, in fact, work like that.
Yeah.
So I wasn't, in spite of what the Sun said at the time, I wasn't really advocating public beheadings in Trafalgar Square.
No, exactly. And so what you're basically saying is this is kind of happening in other religious avenues.
Yeah. So
imagine seeing it.
Think it through, and it may be that some delegated powers for religious courts would be a good way of integrating rather than separating.
Yeah.
And that delegated powers thing is quite important for me. I think we're a society which on the whole is still quite centralist in all sorts of ways. What people call the principle of subsidiarity, make the decisions at the level it's appropriate to make them, I think applies a bit here as well. So long as you're not actually depriving people of their legal freedoms as citizens, then there are things where you can, by consent, agree, we'll sort this out like this.
Yeah. Well, what I find with you, Rowan, is I find myself on the same kind of outlook. Tell me if I'm wrong again, but you're very understanding, and you kind of, it's like you pick no side, although you are, you have been an archbishop, like, and you know, the faith of Christianity, you do understand and are quite fair about whether it's other religions or other people's views.
Well, you know, part of my faith is the faith that there's always something to learn from the stranger.
Yes.
And I was talking in another context recently about a very, very interesting 20th century figure, a French woman who worked as a social worker in a very tough suburb of Paris for about 30 years, but also lived a life of prayer with a couple of other women who shared a house with her. And she was actually director of social services in her area for a while, so you know, a professional. And she wrote a bit about being a Christian and a sort of active Christian in this very secular environment, because the suburb she worked in was dominated by Marxist bureaucrats who really hated the Catholic Church.
Okay. She
said, and it's a lovely formulation, we don't just tolerate other people, we look at them with expectation. We don't just say, well, I suppose we can cope with your being there. We say, okay, what have I got to receive from you? Oh, that's a lovely attitude.
Yeah, it is, definitely. Well, going on to this a bit more with a bit of the conversation with the faith of Islam. This leads on to it, but I would like to go into this first of all. I think anyone who was alive during this time will know where they were on September the 11th. I was actually on holiday with my family coming home that day on a plane, which was quite frightening.
Ooh, yes.
Yeah. We were watching it in the hotel room as we were packing our bags. So it was like we were delayed for hours on end then.
I'm surprised, yes.
But you was actually in New York, not far away from Ground Zero. First of all, what was it like on the day? Like, could you give a bit of a feel of what you saw and how it felt?
Well, yes. I think the worst was not knowing at first what was going on, having absolutely no idea what was going on. I was in a building which was about a block away from the two towers. So the first thing was the sound of the plane hitting the towers, sort of great sort of booming clang. And then, one thing I'll never forget, suddenly the air was full of what looked like snowflakes. All the papers in the offices sucked out through the broken windows. So papers flowing out like a snowstorm through the air. And I was at a meeting, it was a morning seminar for clergy in what was a church building nearby. And we had no idea what was happening. At first, I remember somebody saying, oh, some plane's wingtip has broken a window there. And then it all got very much darker, and we realized something was very wrong. We could see the smoke rising. And I remember we gathered in actually a little room like this one, and watched a television screen. And the big memory of that is the sound of the first building coming down. If you can imagine listening to the noise of a train approaching a station, it was like that. This great swelling noise coming through as the building collapsed, great sort of roar. And then we thought we need to get out of the building and get away somehow. But getting out wasn't straightforward, because by that time the streets were ankle deep in debris and smoke billowing down the streets. And there was also a creche of preschool children in the ground floor room of the block where we were, and they all had to be evacuated. And I can remember getting out through the sort of back door in the lower ground floor into the street with all these children and staff from the church building, and looking round, and everywhere covered with debris, with fragments of paper and wood and yeah. And well, the next couple of hours were unusual, let's say. But by the middle of the day, I and a couple of others had got back to Midtown in New York. And we realized as we walked up through, I think, along Fifth Avenue, we were actually covered with dust and ashes. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And we were still at that point piecing together what had happened. So,
didn't even know that, like, this. You didn't even know it was the World Trade Center at that time, then, I suppose.
Well, we knew which building.
Oh, you was obviously watching the TV, wasn't you?
Yes, and it was pretty clear after half an hour or so. Suddenly, after the first tower came down, yes, this is a terrorist attack. But yes, that was all.
Wow,
all going on. Still quite vivid, really.
Did you Did you pray?
Oh yes, a lot. We prayed in the building. We prayed as we went out, and as we were trying to get down towards the waterfront in the southern part of Manhattan, as far as we could from Ground Zero. At one point we had to take refuge in a porter cabin because that's when the second tower was coming down, and again there was a great cloud of stuff. And I remember so well one of the workmen in that porter cabin just saying, well, I guess we ought to say a prayer, and gathering all of us, some quite high-ranking clergy and others, putting his arms around us and leading us in prayer.
That's unbelievable.
A wonderful moment. And the only that one good story from the other good story is that all the children in the creche got back to their families by the evening, which is a triumph of somebody's organisation.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think people were quick enough to blame Al-Qaeda and other things happened. I know you voted against going to the war in Iraq.
Yes.
You did quote that you feel like you could have done more. What did you mean by that?
I don't know, really. I'm not a great one for conflict, to be honest, and though it's come my way from time to time, but I don't relish it. I suppose the difficult call I felt in the first few months of the war was there's lots of young people from the UK out there with the armed forces. I don't particularly want to send out a message saying you're wasting your time, putting your lives at risk. Though I would like to say that to people in power, you are wasting their lives. And balancing that out was hard. I think some of the latter I wanted to do privately rather than publicly. And I wonder whether I should have been more public about it. That's the main thing. But what I felt I could say and wanted to say and have no apologies for saying was, if you're going to undertake that kind of military action, you've got to have an exit plan. You've got to know what counts as winning, what counts as succeeding. And nobody wanted to hear that.
Well, look what happened just a couple of years ago. This is still known as one of the most embarrassing days for them, really, what happened, isn't it? How they got out of there.
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing. People at that time were very eager to look as if they were responding effectively.
Hellbound, yeah.
Let's get out there and do something.
Yeah.
And that's okay, so long as you really know what that something is and what counts as it working or succeeding. Because, we needed to say, if we were going to do that, we will withdraw when the following things have been achieved. But nobody did, and the result was a failed state in Iraq, which is still with us. We did the same again in Libya in some ways.
Yeah. You did say as well, obviously, when 7/7 happened, it was kind of a similar thing, wasn't it? Where we're blaming straight away, trying to put that blame on. We need to take action.
Yeah.
What did you think about that?
Well, again, I remember that very well because my daughter was still at school in London at that time, and I knew she'd been crossing London that morning. So,
yeah, not a nice feeling.
Not a nice feeling. So it wasn't as if I was exactly unaware of the risks. After the 9/11 thing, when I'd said what I had to say, I had an email from somebody saying, "Don't you realize these people are trying to kill us?" And I wanted to write back, though I didn't. Yet, actually,
I was there.
I do know. I get that. And a bit of the same with 7/7. But I mean, it was a less, slightly less ferocious response, fortunately. A bit more measured. I think we'd learned a little bit. But again, who do we blame, and what do we do so as to look as if we're doing something? Get quite high on the radar, don't they? Rather than, how did this happen? What were the factors allowing it to happen? How do we stop that happening again? And how do we not just react, but proact, if you can put it like that? How do we build the kind of environment where this is a bit less likely to happen?
If you're going to rob a bank, you need that escape plan, isn't it? So we could probably take the money from the bank, but it's getting caught. And
exactly, you don't get on the bus with it.
Yeah.
Not that I would know about.
Yeah, right, Rowan.
My experience is very limited.
Be the perfect bank robber. Yeah, you even said, which leads on to my next question, really. America wields its power in a way that's worse than Britain during its imperial heyday. Do you think them wielding their power in Ukraine is right or wrong?
Ukraine's a difficult... Well, I was going to say it's a difficult case. It's not really morally. It's crystal clear. You know, Ukraine has been invaded by an unprincipled and brutal aggressor. Where's the argument? How you then support Ukraine is something that needs thought. I'm happy that we support Ukraine in military ways. I think intervention on the ground in Ukraine is going to be disastrous because the only possible effect of that is intensifying and kind of aggravating the conflict. I'm glad that the UK has been unambiguous in its support. I think, good for us there for once. I think we got it more or less right. What's interesting is looking at the states and seeing the very, very complicated political attitudes there, where you've got people who would regard themselves as conservatives being very reluctant to do more for Ukraine because they're so focused on domestic issues, and people who would be regarded as kind of bleeding heart liberals pushing for more military intervention. And the sort of political arithmetic around that in the States is pretty complicated. But I think we're probably past the period now where America takes it for granted that it's the world's policeman. I think George Bush was the high point of that. You know, we have the moral right and the political clout to go in and sort everybody else out. And I think we've got a bit beyond that, left and right in the States, and that's no bad thing. Nobody ought to be the world's policeman.
I agree.
After I'd had my jab in what had been a sports hall, looking at the marks of various sports around the place and thinking of sports halls and other things that came to mind, and meditation halls in Buddhist monasteries, and you'll see it all sort of fits in. Face the wall. 15 minutes sitting. Are we there yet? Muffled routines wrapped around, numbers and dates of birth and reassurances. Fatigue. Polite and weaponless fatigue-clad welcomers steering. All afloat in the pungent stream of gel, dense and meandering seaward, as we stare facing the wall, novices in the zendo, bristling for the tread of masters with sticks, or teams braced tight along the floor's hieroglyphs to leap and land the ball. Breathe out. Are we there yet? Featherlight fresh infections drift without landing, weaponless, through the air's rustling, where numbers and dates and reassurances float, while the wall looks back at us, a patient goal that waits to be touched, waits like a gong for striking. And in the drift and rustle, Something has shifted, roots loosening in the belly till we can almost hear it. The body's tight pouch silently punctured.
Beautiful.
The second one's a translation from Welsh from Iris Bowen, who I mentioned earlier. I like this one. It's called Panel on the Arts, and it's about the nature of poetry. There were 4 of us busy discussing the arts. Poetry shouldn't bother with girls or flowers, stuff like that, in a world like ours. That was the critics' considered verdict over the pub table. There's more important things for you to focus on in a world like ours. The language crisis, global tribulations, the meaning of life, and all the rest of it. The talk moved on to this, that, and the other. The twists and turns of life. It emerges, one of us is after a girl. Another's newly into rose growing. And the third is telling us the state of this year's mountain ash is prophesying a hard old winter.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. It's been a huge pleasure to be in the presence of Dr. Rowan Williams. I hope you've enjoyed this one. I don't think you're a social media type of person, are you? I'm not going to ask him to follow you on your social handles. No, honestly, I want to say a really, really big thank you for having you come down. It's been a real pleasure, honestly.
Thanks, Colin. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a privilege.
Yeah, hopefully I'll see you sometime soon in one of the churches. You never know. Yeah, leave us your comments. Let me know what you think. Would you like to see Rowan Williams back again? You never know. Stay central.
The Central Club.